Hello, everybody. My name is Kat Gatley. I'm a student staff here with Gzowski College. I'd like to start today off with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. Today, we have a very special Enwayaang. Enwayaang means the way that we speak together. It's something that we hold very close to us in Gzowski. And speaking of things we hold close to us in Gzowski, I'd like to introduce Dr. Melanie Buddle. Dr. Melanie Buddle is a professor and the principal of Gzowski College here at Trent University. I've had the pleasure of working with Melanie for many years now. She's one of the most passionate and caring educators I've had the pleasure of talking to. She will be teaching a course which will discuss happiness, money, and capitalism this upcoming winter. And this is what she'll be talking about today.
Thank you, Kat. That was lovely. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to start by briefly explaining a new university course that we're teaching in January, since Kat mentioned it and one of the other instructors is on this call. So I'm going to quickly talk about that and then I'll leap into this discussion. So the course is University 1004H, and it's a first-year course meant to be in person. I know in this COVID world, we're going to teach safely distanced in person. First-year students can take the course, and it's called Critical Engagement, but all of the sections of that course have a theme, and the theme will tie back to a larger question of what is the good life. And then through that theme, each of us is taking on a slightly different sub-theme, I guess you would say, to explore the idea of the good life through a particular lens. And then as we do that, we're going to be talking about academic resources, making sure students have some critical engagement, some writing skills, some theoretical skills, some interdisciplinary engagement, and introduce them to other ways of thinking and reading and writing on campus. So I'm teaching one in January called Capitalism, and it's really about money and capitalism and how that relates to the good life. And that's going to be an entire course. I'm going to give you a tiny sneak preview of some of the things I find interesting about this topic today. The other sections, I'm going to ask Stephanie to come on screen for just a second because she's teaching another one of these courses. And if you're a first-year student, or if you know a first-year student who's looking for an in-person class, these are options for students to sign up for January. So Stephanie, who is the principal of Autonomy College, would you like to share your course theme for January briefly?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Steph, like Mel said, from OC. So we're the East Bank, Pride, Soul Sisters, whatever we want to call each other. And yes, Melanie's right. This is going to be an awesome in-person class. Melanie will talk about some of the other sections. There is one that is remote. If folks don't feel comfortable being on campus, and that's a different theme. And it's open to, like Melanie said, all first-year students. So if you are a transfer, it's your first year at Trent, essentially. So I'm going to be looking at answering this question about happiness and what makes a good life through the lens of leadership. So I'm really passionate about helping students and folks develop as leaders. And I think really unpacking how we see leadership. When we think about leaders, we often think about the people at the front of the room with the loudest voices. And I think we also have to think about the everyday moments of leadership. And so we're going to be doing a lot of that and unpacking that. We're going to spend the first few weeks really doing some interactive activities, looking inwards at ourselves and what our values are and what's important to us. And then looking at different types of leaders we admire both within our own lives and in the greater spectrum. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be really interactive. It's probably going to be pretty different than some of the other classes that you're taking. I think it will be challenging in a good way because you're going to have to sit and think about who you are. And it's not going to be like read a whole bunch of things and regurgitate. It's going to be reflection. And so maybe that interests you. So for me, I know Melanie will go into this, I'm sure, but I'm Tuesdays at 5 o'clock. So if you want to spend your evening with me in class, I'd love to see you there. Does that work, Mel?
Yeah, that's great. So the other courses for January, Scott Henderson, who's the dean in Durham, is teaching one on pop culture, which I guess only works if you're a Durham student because he's teaching it in person. Michael Eamon from Trail College is teaching one on narrative and biographies and how I guess what we learn about a good life through learning about other good lives through memoirs and biography. Christine Freeman Roth is teaching a section around food and the good life, which she's also teaching this term. So you may have heard of that, and she's redoing that one again in January. Tina Fridgen from Champlain College is teaching biology and the environment and how nature, environment, and biology connect to a good life. Have I got all of them? Steph, Christine, me.
I think so. It's just all the principles.
Yeah, I think that's all of them, and Scott from Durham. Yeah, so, and I think Christine's is online. So though that's the course if you're interested. So spoiler alert for me, money doesn't buy happiness. So sorry. Some people might think it does, and we'll explore that in a few minutes, but that's my spoiler alert. My other spoiler alert is, you know, I called this talk provocatively Capitalism and Happiness. They don't always go together. Another spoiler alert. We'll get into that a little bit more. But the first main point I wanted to make, having more money doesn't necessarily lead to more happiness. Richer people are not necessarily happier. I'll get back to that point. And I'm giving you a brief overview here. And then when we get into the course in January for first year students, we're going to explore a lot of themes in a lot more depth. Second point, not having money can lead to more unhappiness. If people are poor, they may be less happy because there are, of course, affiliated additional hardships that come with not having enough money. So yes, income matters to happiness, among other things matter as well, but income matters to happiness. As one scholar wrote, deprivation and abject poverty in particular are very bad for happiness. But that doesn't mean, again, that wealth equals happiness. And it also doesn't mean that capitalism is good for happiness. And again, I will come back to that point. A third point I want to explore, happiness may be relative, meaning relative to a change in economic or other conditions. If you suddenly lose or gain wealth, maybe that changes your level of happiness. So there's a relativity piece there. And I'm going to come back to that too. One of the things that the original happiness economist, a guy named Richard Easterlin, theorized about in the 1970s was some of these questions around income, money, happiness, and how we measure those things. So the Easterlin, one of the things that Richard Easterlin is known for is the Easterlin paradox. And the Easterlin paradox, 1974, he wrote this, is that most happiness studies find that within countries, wealthier people are on average happier than poor ones. And on average, wealthier countries as a group are happier than poor ones as a group. But studies across countries and over time find very little, if any, relationship between increases in income and average happiness levels. So happiness seems to rise with income up to a point, but not beyond it. And again, I'll get back to a little bit more around that. Even among the less happy, poorer countries, there's not necessarily a clear relationship between average income and average happiness levels, suggesting that there are many, many other factors, including cultural traits and a host of other ways to measure happiness that are involved in that. Another part of the Easterlin paradox is the theory, well, I guess more the Easterlin theory, is the theory that humans are on a hedonic treadmill. So this means that our aspirations increase along with income, and after basic needs are met, relative rather than absolute levels of income matter to well-being. So on the one hand, relativity is important for how you gauge your happiness or your relative happiness, right, next to somebody else. But your relative income compared to someone else matters as well. So relativity is important to this. Another interpretation of how to make sense of whether or not income makes a difference to happiness is the psychologist's set point theory of happiness, in which every individual is presumed to have a happiness level that he or she maybe goes back to over time, even after major events, such as winning the lottery. In other words, we maybe have a baseline level of well-being that is pre-programmed somehow or further shaped by our environment. And again, these things are related. We may be happy, or we may think we are happy, and then maybe we win the lottery and we think we're really happy, and relative to where we were, maybe that win brought a certain security that can be broadly interpreted as happiness, but maybe eventually the thrill wears off and we go back to our set point. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the sort of argument that, oh, people that win the lottery are miserable, they're not any happier when they have that money. That's kind of been refuted a little bit by some more recent studies. But again, I think it depends on how much the income changed one's circumstance. So if you were living in abject poverty and you won the lottery, it's probably going to bring financial security, which, again, I'm poking at the idea of the word happiness, and I'll get into that in a little while. But again, we know money doesn't buy happiness, even though we are kind of told that it does if you look at all of the ways that we're encouraged to earn money and purchase things. So the word happiness, we probably could unpack a little more, and we will if we have time. But the issue around lottery wins is maybe also we want to think that winning the lottery doesn't make one happier. The initial argument, though, around the lottery was you go back to your set point and it doesn't necessarily bring more happiness, but I think it may bring more security, and that's sort of an important point. So relativity has another role to play in studies of income and happiness. Humans, again, measure their wealth relative to other people around them. If I'm a millionaire and I'm living next door to a billionaire, maybe I don't feel all that satisfied with my lot in life. And as others have pointed out as well, it depends, again, on your way of measuring happiness. What if money isn't the scale? If I have a lot of money, no friends, no community, I may be unhappy. If I have more friends than my wealthier neighbor, I may feel happier relative to him or to her. Now, obviously, happiness is complicated, and I am basically arguing here and will be arguing in January only around this issue of money, because I've picked that as sort of a thing I really want to jump into and talk about: money, capitalism, and happiness. But we all know that there's a lot more complicated stuff at play in that. But bear with me, because for today, we're connecting this stuff primarily to money. So these various points, the idea of relativity, the idea that our happiness may be tied to our environmental conditions, maybe a genetic predisposition, that all might explain why some scholars talk about, as Carol Graham does, the paradox of happy peasants and miserable millionaires. But some people would also just disagree with the idea that there's not a relationship between wealth and happiness. And a number of scholars have published papers fairly recently demonstrating that in fact there is a relationship between per capita incomes and average happiness levels. I don't think those things are necessarily contradictory. I think we can probably agree that some money makes things better. As I said at the beginning, a steadily rising income doesn't seem to lead to a steadily, correlated rising level of happiness. But putting it another way, the part of money that buys happiness is the income security or the stability. So having a sense of financial security is important, and maybe that's kind of what we're poking around at when we say money can buy happiness. A lot of scholars, economists who study the economics of happiness, talk a lot about that idea, not so much of money buying happiness, because they're being a little more academic than I am at this moment, but they're really poking around, not at the idea that money can buy happiness, but that income level matters in your overall well-being. So I think that is one key point, and that income security, again, matters. So instability, even if you're quite wealthy, but your wealth is tied to a very unstable industry, that can bring a level of stress. If you don't know that you're going to keep that income or that job, that can lead to a level of discomfort or unhappiness. And I know you're all saying, oh, but what's happiness? Like, define happiness, Melanie. It's so, it's much broader than that. And I'll let you weigh in on that in a few minutes. But really, some of these theories are suggesting that, the aftermath of wildly fantastic strokes of luck, as one person said, like winning a lottery, or a calamity, on the other hand, might not change your sort of set point overall. And again, that's because we're measuring happiness in many, many ways. Okay, so measures of happiness, what are they? Focusing purely on income obviously can miss key elements of welfare. People have different preferences for material and non-material goods. They may choose a lower paying but more personally rewarding job, for example. Health, your environment, your stability, as I said, of employment, that might matter more than actual money. After a point, again, base needs, survival needs, are what a lot of economists talk about as a set point of maybe not happiness, but like security and satisfaction and well-being, let's say. The World Happiness Report comes out. It's come out 8 years in a row now. The 8th World Happiness Report came out in March 2020. And that has been something that people have pointed at a lot, to say, oh, where are we on the happiness index? I'm sure you've all heard that. And where's Canada on the happiness index? How do we rank in terms of happiness of other countries? We've all heard, Bhutan is known as a happy country. Denmark comes out at the top of the list almost every year. So the World Happiness Report is one of those things that people look at to look at measures of how people are measuring happiness in their own countries. It's done through Gallup polls and through individual questionnaires that people fill out where they're trying to assess their overall assessment of their own happiness. What's interesting about the World Happiness Report is that this year in 2020, it relied on 6 key variables that contribute to explaining sort of the understanding or definition or measures of happiness across countries for that report. And the variables were GDP per capita, social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom, generosity, and absence of corruption. Now, happiness rankings are not based on any index of those 6 factors. The scores are instead based in the World Happiness Report on individuals' own assessment, as I said, of their lives, as revealed by their answers to a survey question that invites them to imagine their position on a ladder called the Cantrell ladder. And the positions are numbered from 0 to 10, where the top represents the best possible position that they feel they're in, and the bottom represents the worst possible life for themselves. So the World Happiness Report asks people to kind of survey where they are on that ladder. And the 6 variables that the Happiness Report is using, those ones I just read to you, are used to explain the variation of happiness across countries and to show how measures of experienced well-being, especially positive affect, are themselves affected by the six factors. So if I went back for a moment to why do I even bring this back to money and capitalism? The 6 variables I just read, none of them actually say money. When you read the World Happiness Report, which you can read because it's online and you can get all of the data from it and just dive right in there, you will see that income, again, does come into that report. So income level and basic needs comes into it. Some other scholars of happiness studies talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of how much you need to survive financially, right? So just looking at happiness and finance around Maslow's hierarchy of needs is kind of interesting. But because I'm talking about money today, and because I'm talking about, again, capitalism and money and wealth and happiness in January, I wanted to explain a little bit of why I'm doing that. I do think that our understanding of happiness and how we define it and whether we have it may be a reflection of our prevailing economic order of capitalism. And I know there are people who would say, you know, you can't draw a link between happiness and an economic system like capitalism. And maybe we would be happy or unhappy in any system, and maybe we would be happy or unhappy regardless of capitalism. So, you know, we can argue about that, and we'll have a robust discussion about it, possibly today, but definitely in the course in January. But I'm making the argument today that our understanding of happiness and how we define it may also be reflecting capitalism, as I said. And that's partly because of another thing that economists have pointed to, and that shows up in the World Happiness Report as well. Income inequality has an effect on happiness, more so than the actual amount of money one has. I said that at the beginning. And the other thing is that disparity amongst people in a country also seems to be related to how people perceive of their happiness, or the country's happiness or the individual's happiness. So bear with me. If capitalism rewards individual gain as opposed to a collective communal gain or communal benefits, then maybe it stands to reason that we're pushing that capitalism pushes us towards individualism, and that individualism and individual accumulation or individual disparity are the things that we see in the least happy countries. And I'll get into that in a bit more detail here. So inequality is negative for the well-being of the poor and positive for the rich. If I'm Jeff Bezos, I'm happy to be much, much richer than others. And in fact, a capitalist economic system rewards me for getting richer. I don't think he's necessarily happy. That's another question. But maybe I can see the advantages I have over my local grocery store employee. But if I'm poor, the gap between me and Jeff Bezos is not bringing happiness. There's no advantage in that gap. And so the inequality signals a persistent disadvantage or an advantage rather than signaling opportunity or mobility. So you will have all heard the ideas of the American dream, of, you know, I can be anything, or that idea that we have often in Western capitalist countries, that you can, you know, go from the bottom to the top and anything is possible and you too can earn $1 million. And then I think what we've done is we've attached that idea of earning to an idea that we're supposed to do that, and that we're supposed to do that to find success. And then if we're measuring that as a measure of success, we're also sort of implying that it's tied to our overall happiness, when in fact it's not. Those things are not lined up. And if you think about literature, spiritual guides and gurus, books, films, you know, the greedy people on Wall Street are not the ones we're supposed to emulate when we see it in fiction. And yet in reality, in real lives, we are part of a capitalist system. We are encouraged to earn and to do better and to move forward. And I think what I'm trying to get at is that the inequality or the income disparity that we see in a capitalist country is one of the things that the World Happiness Report, for one, identifies as one of the things that is often present in countries that don't rate as high on the happiness scale, which I think is pretty interesting. So in terms of the countries and how they rank, generally speaking, I can't remember all of the top 10 and I don't have it right in front of me, but you can look it up. I think we were 11th this year. We had been in the top 10 and Canada dropped to number 11, but this is out of, you know, 250 or something. We went from 9 to 11. The States is, I think, at 18. And then the other countries at the very top, the top countries are, I think, have always been Denmark, Sweden, Scandinavian countries, Finland. And so this is my last point, and then I'll let you all chat about this. This is what I find interesting. You could look at the happiness report and say, well, you've said that money doesn't buy happiness and that being a wealthy country isn't necessarily tied to wealthy citizenry. Maybe not, but really in the top 15 to 20 countries, they're all pretty wealthy. Not all of them, but the high flyers are sometimes also the wealthier countries. And if you're really like a destitute country with a lot of poverty, you're often closer to the bottom of that list. So again, there's a basic pattern there in terms of those countries, but the countries that people think of as wealthy, successful democracies, and I'm going to suggest Canada and the US kind of right now, we're not number 1 and 2. The ones that are number 1 and 2 are the ones where that earlier point I was making about income disparity or about collective well-being versus individual well-being, those Scandinavian countries that score higher, yes, they're also wealthy, that is true, but the difference between a Denmark and a US of A, for example, is a sense of collective well-being and looking after the population. And how we measure that happiness is a feeling of self-worth through service or value and care for other people in society. And yes, that's often tied to higher taxes to pay out collectively to make sure that the needs of the many are taken care of. So there's two arguments here. And again, I know that you could make the argument that I'm tying capitalism in a way that isn't fair. And you could probably very easily argue with me that a socialist country is not inherently happier for all, and that there are many, many people on all sort of ranks and stations of that ladder and all different levels of happiness. And it's not necessarily tied to their economic system, but economic system, governmental system, you'll remember that the 6 variables included absence of corruption, trust in one's neighbor, healthy environment, feeling a sense of well-being. Things that are not directly like, I got richer, I'm happier, are really important to how we measure the good life or happiness. And the reason I think this is interesting is because we kind of all know this stuff. Like, we know that. I don't think I've said anything that's shocking to you, probably right now. So we know all that. And yet, aren't we still encouraged to consume, to have more income? Do we not still sort of valorize people that are wealthier in society? Are we not sort of impressed by like uber rich capitalists? I mean, there's still sort of a cultural honoring of people that make it and do better and get richer. And I think maybe it also prompts us to think a little bit more about what we think happiness is for ourselves, what values we want to put in our worlds and in our society. And when we unpack the good life and happiness, when Stephanie does it in leadership, and when Michael does it in narrative stories, and Tina does it in biology in the winter, part of what we're going to do is broaden that conversation. So instead of just saying, does happiness, does money buy happiness, yes or no? We're going to unpack, like, well, what does it mean to say you're happy? What does it mean to say you're wealthy? Why does it matter if it's relative? Why would one scholar say that winning the lottery makes people happier, but another scholar can say, no, it doesn't, right? Different ways of reading the data, different ways of analyzing why maybe my political ideology might lead me to read the data in a different way. So there's all sorts of stuff that I could cover there. One last thing I wanted to say is that ultimately what many economists and psychologists, and that's where a lot of the study of happiness it comes out of, have shown, what a lot of them have shown is that attention to the individual rather than to collective well-being does not bring the same feelings of happiness. And again, as I said earlier, income inequality or disparity within a country among people does not lead to higher levels of happiness. And so if we broaden that to think about worth and self-fulfillment, and then in addition, we look at the fact that poorer countries are not always on all scales less happy, or actually I should say capitalist countries are not necessarily showing massively high amounts of happiness or well-being, then it seems that the issue of disparity in a country plays a role in how we evaluate happiness. And really, although it's more complicated than money, I'm going to kind of hold to the line here and say that there's a big, deep economic conversation here that we have to have, I think, when we're talking about how we value, and even the word value sounds like money, even though it doesn't have to be, but how we value and put a price on our well-being and on our happiness. So that's like a very quick dive into what I think I'm going to be doing a lot more of in January. And I hope that I got you thinking at least a little bit about money and happiness. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask Kat to open us up, and you can go on screen if you want to. And we usually stop recording at this point, right, Kat? No, we keep going?
No, we keep the recording going, but if somebody has ended up on the screen and they don't want to be, that's totally fine, and I can edit it out later.
Awesome. Okay, so throw it at us. What do you think of happiness and money and the weirdness where we say greedy people are bad in film and television, but then we reward them in real life, for example?
I thought that was a very interesting point. I've never really thought about it deeply in that concept. And I think the whole idea where the big picture of like well-being and money aren't correlated, and how you can tie it all together with like the collective well-being of others. So if I had a lot of money, but I was alone, that doesn't even necessarily mean that I'm going to be happy. You need the collection, you need the caring and community of other people.
Yeah. And we know that inherently, like we know, like, that's why I'm saying we don't just, I think all of you on this call and all thoughtful humans know that that money doesn't buy happiness. Like, we know that. I think what I'm really getting at is that we say that, but we run through an economic system in the West, in Western democracy, in North America, that pushes us more towards individual consumption. And the individualism part is the part that doesn't square very well with the communal well-being part that seems to be the thing that leads to higher levels of, again, happiness, or if you want to broaden the word happiness, a feeling of self-worth, or a feeling of fulfillment, right? Hi, Jonah.
Hi. I just wanted to say a couple things too. From a business point of view, it's kind of like encouraged. I don't know, in like a lot of movies and press releases, you see everybody talking about increasing their stocks, the value of their company, and all those other things. And then you see other news headings related to that saying how companies kind of got away with doing something illegal or harming the environment, kind of thing, all in the name for profit. So as an employee or like growing up, we're obviously not going to be CEOs or leaders in the industry for a very long time. But that being said, how do we kind of relate that back to happiness in organizations? Like if if financial success and capitalism and this focus on making money isn't the solution, how do we as future business leaders actually put that into motion? How do we actually take what we're learning potentially in your course to kind of shift the thinking from capitalism to more of a open structure, not really socialist or whatever, but something kind of focusing more on, like you said, the whole picture rather than the individual?
That's a great question. I mean, I think part of the problem is that we've set up a system where your company is more successful, as you said, Jonah, if it earns more in stocks or if it's worth more, you know, in a trading sense or on the stock exchange. And so the value it become, and you think about even an example of like, you know, Apple's not doing well unless Apple makes exponentially more money. It's not okay really to kind of just pay your employees and be okay because of the stock market. You don't benefit if you don't continue to accumulate. And again, I want to be careful because I'm not arguing that people shouldn't seek out success for themselves either. But I think your question is a good one. Is the success you're seeking, is it for, I mean, I don't think most of you, when you think about a successful career, you think, well, I must make $1 million or I will not be there. Like, I don't think we think that way. But we do think a little bit about like, well, what's enough? And then how will I be valued? Oh, I got a raise, I'm of value. And then if you're thinking about a company and how you would treat employees, I mean, if we went back historically, I'm a historian, so I think about this historically. We've had different eras in society where we've said, oh, well, maybe the way to do well in this company is to pay the employees more, or maybe the way to do well in this company is to give employees a gymnasium to have exercise, and then they're healthier. And actually it benefits me because if they're healthier, then they're going to work harder for me. And then I still actually am more successful. But that's still predicated on the success being somehow that the company does better or makes more money, right? And I think that it's not as though, you know, if you look at the countries like Denmark, it's not like in Denmark they're all living in communist style apartment housing and driving the same car. Like, we're not talking about everyone has to be the same, but we are talking about when this is what I'm talking about anyway, when you gain more wealth, what do you do with it and what does it bring back? So coming back to your question, if you were a successful business person in your, you know, 50-year-old self, Jonah, I would say, well, what do you want to leave in the world and what's important to you? So at least knowing what your values are. So you could say, well, actually, I think it's more important that all my employees make a bit more money. The company does okay, but we're all employed. But where I would say is the problem with capitalism is that you are going to be penalized if you don't continue the upward trend, unless you're in a different kind of a sector, which is why many people choose not-for-profit or NGO or government or academia, right? It's not because, I mean, it's not necessarily a conscious choice to say, I don't want to be on the stock market, but it might be a way to say, well, there's different ways of showing success. Success at Trent might be that you guys all graduate and have a really happy, successful life, however you define it. But we're not looking for you to make us into millionaires. So that was a really long answer. I'm sorry.
No, but I agree, Melanie, because I think about myself like when I was 17, 18, 19, when I first realized what the Sunshine List was. And for those of you that don't know, the Sunshine List is they print the salaries of anybody who makes over $100,000 in the public sector. And I was like, I need to be on the Sunshine List because it gives the idea of sunshine and happiness. And this was a thing. And now I couldn't care less. I'm not on the Sunshine List. But it goes back to your values, which is something we're going to talk about in our course. Because I would ask, you know, for Alex, their video is on. I'd be like, what are your top 5 values? And it's tough sometimes to answer that right away. So really sitting and thinking about what does bring us value, what does bring us joy, and making sure that our lives have that infused. And so like, I'm throwing Martin into this, who's on here. If sustainability is one of your values, looking at what opportunities can feed those values in those jobs. So for me, it's relationships and connection. Being a college principal is perfect because it feeds that value. Do I need enough money to survive? And yes, sure. But I'm going to leave a job, and I left a job. I left a job that paid me $25,000 more, with a car, with an expense account, with a computer, with a phone, because they were no longer, our values did no longer aligned. And that meant more to me and my happiness than the paycheck. Some of you may be like, she's crazy. But that's how I ended up here at Trent. And so, yes.
The reason people would say, oh, she's crazy, is because I really think, and I'm not like, I do actually believe this. I think we are inherently trained to think we're supposed to get all that stuff you just listed, Stephanie, and to think that it's weird if we turn it down or walk away from it. And I think we say that at the same time as we say, be a good values-driven person. Don't do things for the money. Don't be like Great Gatsby and the wealth and eccentricity of the ultra rich, right? And yet we still reward the accumulation of money. We really do reward it, right? And so that is just I think it's a hypocrisy we live with, but I think it's worth thinking about, especially if you yourselves on the call are thinking about your careers and your lives, right? And again, I'm being careful because I'm not suggesting that earning more is bad. And I'm not even, I'm kind of poking that capitalism is bad, but lots of systems are bad, and they're not all, capitalism is not inherently, it's not a person. It doesn't have an emotion. It is what you make of it. Some people would argue it's about efficiency, and it's about like a more efficient economic system. But I think where I'm going with that is that if it is more individualized, and if that individual comparative piece is the part that can breed discontent, then that's something to unpack, right? And actually, one more thing on the sunshine list too. The sunshine list, only public sector employees. So instead of being like, huzzah, somebody made a lot of money, it's more like, what? How did a teacher make that much money, right? And nobody sees the salary of the actual big money guys. I mean, they see Jeff Bezos' salary, but they don't see the big money of a bank, a bank, a head honcho of a bank. They don't see that salary. They don't see the $1 million salary. So then we all get hung up on the 100 grand of the public sector because they have to declare their salary, and that breeds competition, and that breeds a feeling of comparative advantage and inequality. And that's what I'm saying partly breeds that unhappiness that you see in the happiness index. Martin, how do you do something like Clean Tech Commons? I'm going to put him on the spot.
I know, seeing I've been on the call for like all of 7 minutes. And I apologize. You were my highest priority today.
Thank you.
And then a competing conference in Salt Lake City took all of my time, I'm afraid.
That's fine.
So I missed the presentation part, but I will absolutely agree that capitalism is, without, and paraphrasing someone way more famous than I, is absolutely the worst economic system out there, except for all the others, of course. Right.
But when you're working with something like, if I'm thinking about Clean Tech Commons, or I'm thinking about Peterborough, if you take it down to a Peterborough level, your goal in terms of how you succeed in the development of Clean Tech Commons, I would actually argue, I'm going to, give you a little compliment here. It's not really about like earning $1 million for Clean Tech Commons. It's about sustainability and jobs for people, and creating an environment that can be a producer of value that's an alternative, right?
So Clean Tech Commons as a university-linked, clean technology-focused research park is all about the greater good. It's about, developing, researching, developing, commercializing clean, green, and low-carbon technologies. And that is clearly about serving a greater good, and it's about addressing global energy, environment, and climate challenges. Now, how do we do that? We do that, I think, in two ways. By commercializing technologies of university spin-outs. So companies that come, being able to spin out or commercialize the technology that comes from within academic research. And it's about supporting startup companies. And the truth be told, many more of those companies actually do what they do because it aligns with their own interests. People often get into clean technologies, not because it's where they're going to make the most money, but
Right.
it's because it does align with their own values, and it does allow them to actually make a reasonable living, but contribute to society and community in a very, very significant way. And I'm finding of the companies that I'm starting to talk to about locating a clean tech commons, that is an overarching principle that so many of them share. So you're absolutely right. And that's where I think you can find the two goals are compatible. Of course, if they do well commercially, they're also delivering a better product to the market, which will help address some of those energy, environment, and climate challenges. But I think you're right. They don't have to be either or decisions one makes. And I think moving into the workplace and into the job market, and if you're looking at your own startup, you're looking at doing something that you're absolutely passionate about, that you love, and that you can actually make a reasonable success of.
Yes, and that's the interesting piece there around success. And we sort of talked about this at the beginning, but as I said, like a certain amount of income is necessary to subsist, and people below that income point are going to say that their overall well-being and actual happiness are harmed if they don't have enough money to eat and if they can't afford rent. But remember that I also said that people can be relatively well off but have instability in their employment, and that causes a level of stress that lowers them on the happiness index as well. So there's a couple of different things happening there. There's stability, and stability can be, I don't make a ton of money, but I'm stable and my job is protected and I'm comfortable and I've got good support networks and I'm happy about my environmental stuff and I'm a good volunteer in my community. But you could be, wealthier than that, but have a less stable income, and that would not bring happiness. And let's add, there are happy millionaires and very unhappy poor people. The other thing that drives me crazy sometimes about the happiness studies is but everybody in that small impoverished nation, they're just so happy. They're all smiling. I wish we were all more like that. It's like, okay, they are maybe happier when in certain ways. And I'm not preaching that everybody needs to become a capitalist, because that's not my thing. But if you looked deeply at disparity in the country and whether people have lower life expectancy and ill health and poor living conditions, I mean, having a good outlook is lovely, but basic needs need to be met as well, right? And there are some countries where you can see that they do well on some parts of the happiness index, but they're not at the top of the list because actually they're not meeting the economic part well enough, right? So those, as I said, those top countries happen to have a correlation with being wealthier, but the wealth on its own is not the thing that gets to the top of that list.
Please tell me that you included a talk about Maslow's hierarchy at the front end of this conversation.
I did mention Maslow's hierarchy.
You did, excellent.
Very
Just proving that Melanie is bookish. She told you all about Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah, I didn't go too far because I got to save something for January, but yes.
That's right. And anyway, I can just tell you folks, I absolutely understand the happiness index. I'm married, so I'm very low down on the happiness index.
Well, there was one of the things around the lottery discussion, that talks about like divorce can bring happiness or unhappiness for the person, depending on how they feel after the divorce. But back to the set point of happiness, that if it's a calamity, you don't necessarily, your ultimate happiness maybe doesn't change as much as people think it will. And I find that super interesting as well. I mean, I'm not saying everything is genetically predisposed, but I do think it's interesting that you could have someone who has relatively great stuff and relatively great support networks and seems to do well on the happiness scales, but they're just miserable, right? They're just not there. But I think what I'm talking about is large trends of finance and wellness. And what I'm prompting us to think about is individualized consumer culture and consumption, and how we're encouraged to think that those are the things that are going to bring us that sort of successful, happy situation. But we all know that it doesn't work that way, but we're fed it all the time. I think we're fed it. I think it's good to think about it and challenge that in ourselves. And that's why I liked Jonah's question about how do you think about that if you're trying to go into business. Again, I wouldn't say don't go into business or don't earn money. I just think it's worth thinking about what you want to do with the money, and is it going to make a difference? And how you use that money in a greater good for your own consumption, whatever it is, at least critique what it's doing for you and how you fit into that system, right? Kat, did you, oh, you're not ready yet, sorry.
One thing you said about like the collectivism is like, if you even look at the pandemic right now, like countries that you like, the happy countries that are collective, like Sweden, have done quite well in their response to the pandemic because they are all collectively looking out for each other, whereas places in the States have not done as well. So I think even like relating that to now, you can kind of see how that can have effects for more than just happiness, but even the health of the country.
Yeah, great point.
Really good point.
And that's what's so interesting is it's not just money, it's income disparity and individualized ways of looking at your world, right? I also heard the other day that some countries, I think China was one of them, are sort of puzzled that why would we not accept further, encroachments on our personal freedom if it saved our elderly? Like, why don't we care about our old people? Is kind of the interpretation. Like, why are we not being harsher and locking people down? Do we not actually care about people? And I can see how when you can kind of relate that when you think about, well, libertarianism and the idea that like, but I deserve something. I need to go out. It's not fair. You're like, okay, but you maybe had to sacrifice something collectively to help more people collectively, right? And we're not so much built for that in North America. But again, I would say we're not so much built from that, from a fairly recent history, from developing a system. And again, I'm not going to pin it all to capitalism, but still developing a system that rewards a more individualistic approach, right? So yeah, it's totally relatable to pandemic times, Noah. Anyone else want to throw an idea out there or ask a question?
I'll just make like maybe a little bit of a cheesy little connection here. But I thought might be nice to bring up near the end. But I think like if you narrow it down, like your concept of like the evaluation of the 6 key variables, and even if you take it down from a country and narrow it down to something like Peterborough or even just our Trent community. So I was thinking of that and I was like, I want to appreciate how the categories of evaluations, so like social support, freedom, generosity, and then the like general idea of collective well-being for others and caring, we can connect that to Trent and our colleges and having our colleges in small little groups to have that sustainability and dependency on a small group of people that you relate to. And I think that just shows that us as a community in Trent, we're committed to being happy and committed to making a change and committed to doing what's right in terms of well-being for everybody in our community. And also I think that it has a little bit of a statement saying that Mel could talk about a lot of things, but she talks about making people happy. And that's good.
Nice. Thanks, Kat. That's really sweet. And yeah, that relationships, when I was talking about relativity earlier in the talk about, relative wealth and relative income or relative to other people, that's how people sort of often gauge themselves. But it's also relationships are important. So that, yeah, you're right, the relationships between people. If comparing yourself to others wasn't like, what, why are they on the sunshine list, or why are they making more? And if it was more like, oh, how's my neighbor? that's kind of going to bring a different sense of value. And I think what a lot of people know already inherently is that the more you give, the better you feel. And I know that sounds a bit cheesy, but it's not just about donations. It's about like giving of time, or thinking about even thinking about the fact that you yourself are a small cog in the wheel, right? Like your importance in the world, and I say this with love and not in a mean way, we're not that important. We're small beings in a larger piece, and thinking about it that way kind of, it eases that pressure of, but I'm supposed to be something else, or I'm supposed to do this, or I'm supposed to lead here or earn more or be something different. No, you're a small piece of a larger ecosystem in every sense, and how you decide to interact with that is really important to your future. So that's what I'm talking about. I would encourage you all to look at the World Happiness Report. You can access it really easily. And the other thing I think, no, I'll save that. Well, yeah, there's actually there's a pretty interesting video called The Happiness Fantasy, and it's a lecture by a business scholar named Carl Cederstrom. And if you just look up the Happiness Family or the Happiness Fantasy, you'll find it. But it's an hour-long talk he does. But he is doing a little bit more of that connection between consumption and individualized consumption and capitalism in North America, and what that feeds into in terms of how we evaluate our happiness, really. So very interesting. You should look that one up. Okay, I'm gonna let you all go. I really appreciate that you signed on and that you gave us your attention for the hour. It's been interesting and fun speaking about this. If you want to know more interesting deep dives into money and capitalism, and in the course I'm going to talk about, I am going to get back into the lottery in a more detailed way. We are going to talk about fiction and literature and how we portray people who have wealth and what that says about our idea of happiness. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about consumption and advertising in the course. And we're going to define happiness and metrics for happiness and get into all of that in a little more detail in January in person for those that are in first year and want to take it. I think that's all I have. So thank you very much. And we do post the videos on our Gzowski website. Thanks everyone for coming and have a great evening.